I just wanted to point that out to show you here's another, you know, historical angle that went for about 200 years that no one even associates with the long war between the West and Islam, which is basically Russia and the Tatars, who identified as Muslims and articulated their war on Russia through jihadi terminology. And then we come to America. So America, because the Barbary pirates, as I was saying, and also the Tatars, especially the Crimean, the Golden Horde, and then it became the Crimean Sultanate. Between those two, in just 200 years, they enslaved 5 million Europeans. 5 million, and they sold them in the enslavement and the selling and the subsequent treatment is all the sort of thing that you saw with ISIS when they enslaved Yazidi women and Christian women and whoever else and sold them. It was the same thing and explained in the same rationale by citing Islamic doctrine. And so now coming to the United States and the Barbaries, America's very first war, not many people are aware of this, which they actually had before America could elect its first president, Washington, was with the Barbary pirates. Okay, and it's you know, here we go again. When Thomas Jefferson and John Adams met with Barbary's ambassador, and they basically said, "Why are you kidnapping our sailors? What have we done to you? How are we your enemy?" Here's how the ambassador replied. Thomas Jefferson wrote, the ambassador answered us, I'm quoting him, that it was founded on the laws of their prophet, that it was written in their book, the Quran, that it was their right and duty to make war upon non-Muslims wherever they could be found and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners. Okay, something straight out of ISIS. So why don't we know this? I mean, I imagine this is probably a surprise to some of you who thought you had a good idea of what really happened in history between Islam and the West. I'm sure a lot of you didn't fall for the apologetic one where, you know, Islam was wildly progressive and Europe was wildly backwards. But I think when you really look at it, this is just 180 degrees from what we are normally told. And now I'd like to get into that and talk a little bit about what's going on and how historians twist it and why. They do it, I'll give you one, so I referred to him earlier. So his name is William R. Polk, and he's well entrenched with the leftist, pro-Islamic, academics. And he wrote a book that came out the same year mine did, called Jihad and Crusade, the 1,000-Year War between the global north and the south, by which he means global north Europe, and the south he means Islam. Okay? Now, here's the sort of things that he writes. He writes this, and I quote him. Oh, so wait, let me just tell you this. So his book, which is titled The 1,000-Year War, is 550 pages long. Okay? 30 pages, the initial 30 pages are devoted to the first 1,000 years of conflict, which I just discussed. And in those 30 pages, you will get none of what I talked about. All you will get is Islam somehow amorphously spread around because people found it appealing. And then he'll talk about Andalusia and the wonderful culture that they produced, even though you saw that quote I read from Bertrand, the historian, about how bad it was for Christians in Spain. And then in his, so that's the 30 pages out of 550. The rest of the book is all about colonialism and how, just your evil Europeans for no reason decided to go and invade and attack and ruin the Islamic world. And that's why they're angry and they want to kill us. So here's a quote from him. Beginning at various times after Christopher Columbus led the way across the Atlantic and the Portuguese plunged down the West African coast, the actions of the North, meaning Europe, have been uniformly destructive and sometimes genocidal. The first cause of the danger and insecurity, he's referring to Islamic terrorism, that we feel today is this long history of imperialism. He's talking about a century of colonialism, but he didn't talk about 1,000 years of Islamic imperialism. A century or more of invasion, occupation, humiliation, and genocide that has left scars that are still not healed amongst Muslims and cannot heal if they are constantly reopened. Now here's another quote from Bernard Lewis that is much better and really puts us in context, because what Polk is trying to show you is that, starting with Columbus and all these people decided to just enter and, without any reason, conquer and devastate and commit genocide, his word, against the Muslim world. Now, here's what a balanced, sober historian like Bernard Lewis says about the colonialism. He writes, quote, "The whole complex process of European expansion and empire has its roots in the clash of Islam and Christendom. It began with the long and bitter struggle of the conquered peoples of Europe in East and West to restore their homelands to Christendom and expel the Muslims who had invaded and subjugated them. It was hardly to be expected that the triumphant Spaniards and Portuguese would stop at the Straits of Gibraltar, or that the Russians would allow the Tatars to retire in peace and regroup along their bases in the upper and lower Volga, the more so since a new and deadly Muslim attack on Christendom was already underway, threatening the heart of Europe. The victorious European liberators, having reconquered their own territories, pursued their former masters whence they had come." That's what the reality is. That's what made Europeans enter the Islamic world and colonize them in the first place. It was the culmination of this long war that modern day historians don't mention, because they start just with the colonial era and don't tell you that for 1,000 years the Islamic world was terrorizing the West. I'll give you another example from Polk's book, which was well received amongst academics. He has a chapter titled "Somalia, the Failed State." And again, imperialism is the blame all. That's why Somalia is a failed state. However, in 1855, decades before any Europeans had entered Somalia, the adventurer, the notorious adventurer Richard Burton, described Somalia in very unappealing terms. He said, quote, "Somalis are, quote, extremely bigoted, especially against Christians, and are fond of jihading," end quote. Now, to me, today, if you look at Somalia, it still seems quite the failed state. Al-Shabaab, their premier terrorist organization, is his jihadi vanguard, and any Somali who's exposed as a Christian is instantly beheaded. So is European colonialism really necessary to explain this continuity that, Richard Burton saw from over 100 years ago and what we're seeing today? Do we need to pin that on, Europeans coming in? And the greater irony, which again is never mentioned, is that whereas all the jihads that went throughout history culminated in slavery, depopulation, and devastation, at least the European colonialists, they abolished slavery, introduced their Muslim subjects to the boons of modernity, from scientific and medical advances to the radical concepts of democracy and religious freedom. Okay, and here's, for example, a Christian Copt from Egypt. He writes, in a word, and he's writing at the peak of the colonial era, and he writes, "In a word, we say that the Egyptian state was at the highest degree of justice and good order and arrangement, and it removed religious fanaticism and almost established equality between its subjects, Christian and Muslim, and it eliminated most of the injustice." He's talking about colonialism. "And it realized much in the way of beneficial works for the benefit of all." And yet, Western European colonialism that brought these boons and did not force Muslims to convert or apostatize and just brought equality to all subjects is what academics just lambast as such a horrible thing, whereas the non-stop depredations and slavery doesn't even get mentioned at all. It's interesting, and here's a final quote I'd like to share, which I find really interesting, and it's from a European historian by the name of Hilaire Belloc, if I'm pronouncing it right, maybe Beloche, I don't know. And he was born in 1870, and he died in 1953, and that really is the height of Western might vis-a-vis the Islamic world, including through colonialism. And at this point, no one thought, Islam, most Europeans didn't even know what Islam is. It was just, these are backwards people as they were described. But here's what he wrote in right around 1940, when no one in America or the West was worried about Islam. He wrote, quote, "Millions of modern people of the civilization of Europe and America have forgotten all about Islam. They have never come in contact with it. They take for granted that it is decaying and that anyway, it is just a foreign religion which will not concern them. It is, as a fact, the most formidable and persistent enemy which our civilization has had, and may at any moment become a large menace in the future as it was in the past. The whole spiritual strength of Islam is still present in the great masses of Syria and Anatolia, of the East Asian mountains, of Arabia, Egypt, and North Africa. The final fruit of this tenacity, the second period of Islamic power, may be delayed, but I doubt whether it can be permanently postponed." And this is a pretty remarkable insights that he had at the time when Islam was essentially a spent force. So moving on now quickly to modern day Christian persecution, and how the history that I just shared with you is essentially repeating itself. So now you still have Christians in the Islamic world. Some are indigenous, the Copts, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, and so forth. Some converts from missionaries, Protestants and Catholics. But if you look right now, the same attacks that Islam did historically to Europe that I recounted, which is what ISIS did, is what is happening right now to Christians. Their churches are either being bombed or just being banned by governments. They're being, and here's the thing, the news media only reports something sensational, like Sri Lanka, the bombing, or when a Coptic church gets bombed and 20, 30 people die. What people don't know though is there's less sensational but constant slow motion bleeding going on all across the Islamic world. One organization, human rights organization, Open Doors, publishes every year what's called a World's Watch List. And it documents the 50 worst nations in the world to be a Christian in. 38 of them happen to be Muslim majority. And how telling is that? And the patterns that I just mentioned, like I said, attacking churches or synagogues or any other temple, treating infidel women as sex objects, which we also see now in Europe, in Western Europe, Sweden, which is I think almost the rape capital, and it's all actually associated with the influx of Muslim migrants. And when you see the words they say, they'll say something like, you white women or you infidels are you just exist for sex. In the history, in my book, you actually have Muslims saying the same thing from 1,000 years ago. So you see this ongoing pattern that just doesn't stop. The Christians are being kidnapped and plundered of money, held for ransom, and the logic is because they're not paying jizya, which according to Islamic law, tribute, they should in order to exist in an Islamic state. Apostates are being killed, blasphemers, all the things that have happened historically against Europe and of course North Africa and the Middle East is still happening now in Egypt and North Africa and the Islam, all the way into Indonesia, and sub-Saharan Africa is probably one of the worst areas where Christians are being slaughtered, especially Nigeria, but other regions, Kenya, increasingly even Uganda. So to me, it's really hard to counter this unwavering line of continuity of Islamic aggression, which always has the same pattern that we've described, which expressed itself century after century through different groups of people who had nothing to do with each other: Arabs, Berbers, Tatars, Mongols, Persians, Turks, and they all use the same terminology that ISIS used. As I showed you in that early anecdote where in the battle in 637, what the sword of Allah, as he's known, was saying is what they're saying right now. When they say, break the cross, we will conquer your Rome, that is an actual verbatim quote from historical Muslims. So it's also good for Americans and Westerners to catch up on history and actually see what they know and what they're trying to emulate. And so it's just one long story of immense continuity with an immense parallel between past and present. And yet we're living in a day and age where, to go back to what I started speaking of, someone like me of Middle Eastern descent, Egyptian descent, can't talk about this now in front of the War College because the co-religionists of the people who have been doing this century after century are saying I'm a racist and crying about it. And that's where we are today. Thank you.